So I recently took a week off of work, and instead of spending that time with friends and family, I decided to spend it talking to pixelated characters on a computer screen. I've spent a lot of time on this channel criticizing grand strategy games, and as we all know, you can't criticize something unless you try to make it yourself. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. I'm going to be creating a grand strategy game in the style of Paradox Game Studios in just 1 week. Will I succeed, or will I obviously fail? There's only one way to find out. There's a lot that goes into a grand strategy game's development. You've got to review historical documents, you've got to simulate entire economies, and create a game that's actually fun to play with all these random systems. It's just extremely complex and probably requires an extremely detailed design process. So we're going to skip all of that and just dive into day one. No plan, we're just going to start with the map. And yeah, let's see how it goes. We only have 6 days, so, kind of got to get started. Day one started, of course, with the map. So I found a satellite image that I had on my computer for some reason and threw that into a Unity scene as the background texture on a standard Unity terrain. And within a couple hours, this is 6 hours in, I had a basically functional map. I had to hand paint the elevation using Unity's tools, but just by tracing the coastlines and having a basic sense of geography, I could put something together that was reasonably accurate. I spent the rest of day one throwing in units and setting up basic pathfinding for those units. Units right now are just these little purple pills, and when you click on them, you're able to select them and they turn green, and then you can click somewhere else on the map and they will pathfind over to that spot. One thing that's cool about this system just automatically is that you can set them to avoid obstacles based on the slope of the terrain that they're walking on. This is because they're using something called a nav mesh, which was very easy to set up with basic Unity terrain and allows me to have some basic functionality that you can see on screen right now. We can also select multiple units at the same time and they'll all pathfind to wherever they need to go. I also set up a little bit of code just to display the pathfinding using a thick red line and a little bit of UI showing the number of units on each army. Right now, there's no basis for this. It's just a little container that holds a number. You can also see I put in a little bit of watercolor and a little bit of an animation on that water. That's actually a shader that's doing some calculations in the background for us to try to make the water look a little bit nice. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have been doing this on the first day. The water ended up taking a lot longer than I expected and, ultimately was not a core element of gameplay. But I think it looks pretty good so far. Or at least for 1 day. I spent about 6 hours working on it the first day, and I think for 6 hours this was pretty good. So day two, immediately the map looks completely different. We have a different watercolor. I tweaked the colors of the satellite image as well, and you can see a lot more things going on the screen. Now, just to talk through the map a little bit, the map is still hand painted by me, so I did a little bit more of that. I did the coastlines of North Africa and most of the Mediterranean. I skipped Greece because of all those little islands that I didn't want to deal with. But what's cool about this whole system is that the nav mesh, which allows units to pathfind, automatically updates when I make changes to the terrain. I also built a quick little time system. So one thing I haven't talked about yet is the setting of this game. I decided to set the game in 814 AD, which is the year that Charlemagne dies at the very beginning of the year. I figured that would be a cool time to start setting a game where you have Muslim conquests in the south, you have the partial breakdown of the Carolingian Empire in the north, and some cool stuff happening in Spain. I don't know, it might be cool. We have a basic calendar system. It was actually kind of complicated to find the right calendar system that would actually function in terms of our modern calendar in an understandable way. So there's a good chance that these dates are wrong, but we don't need to get into that. In terms of actual gameplay, look at that. We have battles now. Battles actually function pretty simplistically. I modeled this more or less based on EU4, where the number of units does some morale damage and also does damage to the enemy, total units. So we have a little bit of a UI thing going on here that I built. And currently when morale hits 0, nothing happens, but I'll fix that in the next day. And yeah, that's about it. We have a system for battles. We have a system for, enemy armies and friendly armies. We have a basic system of moving armies around. We have a basic map and we have a calendar. So we basically have all the core systems of a game. This day also took me about 6 hours to do, so we're looking at 12 hours of work, and we're on day 2 out of 6. Whether we're a third of the way there or not, now that's up to you. But at this point, I was feeling pretty confident that I'd have something to show for this whole challenge at the end. Now, in day 3, we really start to see the makings of an actual game. The first thing you can notice is that the map looks a little different again. I changed the perspective of the camera, and we have a little bit of a cleaner look in the water, and also some really interesting stuff going on the map. We actually have settlements now, and as I hover over these settlements, you can see there's tooltips popping up. It's a little bit of interesting information being conveyed. And if you look closely, you'll also see navies. Now, navies are just reskins of armies that go in the water at the moment. But what's cool about that is that they can use a separate nav mesh that only allows them to walk on water. And they basically just function exactly the same way. We just need to tweak the code a little bit. But I'll get to that in the next day. The other thing we achieved today was multi-path finding. So now armies can queue a bunch of locations that they're going to walk to, similar to something like Paradox games where you just hold shift and then you can click on multiple spots and they'll walk to all those spots. Let's talk a little bit about settlements. So settlements right now are represented by these very low poly house looking things, and they're textured based on the color of the country that owns them. So I had to write all the code for creating a country and all the code for, what a settlement is. And that was a lot of foundational stuff that's not really visible, but you can kind of see what's going on in the tooltips. So in the tooltips, we see the owner tag ID and the number of population in that settlement. And you can kind of tell that the settlement model is actually scaled with the population level. That's a cool little way of indicating on the map that there's a bigger city somewhere. And then a little bit of tooltip information, but honestly, not much more than that. Now, I have to say, day 4 is where things start to get interesting. You can already tell there's a completely different perspective on this whole thing. You can now finally drag to select units in a lasso, which is nice. Navies are actually functional. They actually show the number of units in terms of number of ships. They don't just show they're not just armies in the water now. And I reworked the map yet again, scaling it a little bit differently at this time. When it comes to the map, you can also see that I've completely redone the settlements, adding in tons more settlements. I tried to use historical data that I found, and basically, there's just the level of detail has just grown a lot. So the map feels bigger, even though it's covering the same area. And this is the first day that I feel like this actually looks like a game. We have our armies walking around in circles. We can actually multipath. We have a UI in the top left corner that's displaying some information. We have functional battles that actually end and actually tell you who won. And we have a tooltip system that functions pretty differently from before. So on day 3, I had tooltips that activated when you hovered over the actual settlement model. But now tooltips are coming up no matter where you're hovering near the model. So to do that, I had to create a texture that basically maps the nearest province to each point on the map. And this is a really, really slow process because it's doing it manually on the CPU because I don't know how to do shader programming. And this is where some of the technical limitations of my knowledge are really starting to show. But, I got this going, so it's not the worst thing in the world. Basically, the cursor will sample this texture and check to see what code, what color is registered on each point as you're hovering over the map. And then it references a table to figure out what country and what settlement you're looking at. And then you can reference that information and display it in the tooltip. So that was a cool little thing. I felt like a real programmer when I was doing that. And it allows us to create another map, which brings up an issue I've been having. And this is the country map, right? And you can see it's pretty pixelated because this takes multiple minutes to bake every time. But what this map does is basically samples the other map and just checks who owns each province and colors it that color. Instead of checking the nearest settlement, it checks who owns that settlement. So it turns out to create a pretty amazing looking map. And I really felt like, wow, this is actually a game that's starting to simulate a world here. But when it came to actually displaying this map on the land masses, we run into some issues. The main issue is the resolution of the map, which is that it's just not a very high res photo. I could make it higher res, but then the bake time would be longer. And bake time is fine because it doesn't happen at runtime until you realize that anytime a settlement gets transferred to someone else, we're going to have to rebake the whole image. So obviously this isn't a functional solution. The other thing is I wanted to design a game where you could have settlements that actually move around. When I was looking at this map, I was like, wow, this kind of looks like Mountain Blade. What would be cool about Mountain Blade is if settlements could move. What if you had these nomadic groups and you could move them around and become like a nomadic state during this time period? That would be so cool. Now, EU5 has a similar idea with pop and army based countries, but this would be like modeled more as like the cities moving, and you could call the city like a tribe or something like that. I just think there's a lot of potential for something like this in terms of game design options. Day 4 is also the first day that I started using a wiki system to manage the game design document for this game. I was using Obsidian, which I highly recommend if you want to make a little wiki for yourself. And I've actually used this on different projects for this channel too, like my Civ 5 video. It's just a really good way of concentrating information, and it's completely freeware and open source, so you can just use it forever offline. Some other additions I made today are obviously the UI, which displays some military information, some national information, and a basic economy. A lot of this is placeholder stuff, but there is actually some computation going on in the background to calculate everyone's values. Okay, so day 5 is really something else. I completely reworked the map all over again. I got a new satellite image and scaled everything up even more, and decided to limit the playable area to just the Mediterranean this time to gain even more resolution. And wow, I mean, it looks a lot better in my opinion. The water looks a little bit jank, but aside from that, it's just a much more polished look. And another benefit of doing this way is that I used satellite imagery that actually had a height map. So I could just plop that in and scale it up a bit, and all of a sudden we have a height map without me having to manually paint everything. So this is the point where I officially decided to limit the playable area to just the Mediterranean. And you can kind of see what the world looks like using a scaled up height map of real life. And just to be clear, what I mean by scaled up is that I multiplied the real heights by like an order of magnitude. I don't actually remember how many orders of magnitude, but I'm guessing it's probably 100 or 1,000 times higher than in real life, since in real life, the Earth is basically a pancake wrapped into a sphere. I kept fleshing out the military features because I figured that was the thing that was going to make the biggest difference at this point. So I introduced a system for supplying armies based on the nearest settlement, and that gets displayed in green when an army is nearby a friendly settlement. I thought this would have a lot of gameplay potential. One of my favorite parts of EU5 is using boats to feed armies across straits. It just looks cool and feels good. And managing logistics is always going to be a fun little gameplay system for armies. If you'll notice on the right over here, we also have individual regiments now. So these are being displayed in the army tab, and yeah, they have their own stats and everything. They don't really affect combat that much yet, but I do have a new simulated system for displaying battles, which basically lines units up similar to something like EU4, and then lets them do damage to each other individually. I basically just use a dice roll to do all this damage, but I'm envisioning something a little bit more interesting in the future. You remember earlier when I said that we had an issue with map modes? Well, this came to a head here when I decided to map the settlements PNG onto the playable area so you could actually visualize what was going on. This was helping me with debugging, but it was also rattling around in my head as I was trying to find a solution for displaying province ownership while still allowing nomadic settlements to exist. And needless to say, I didn't come up with anything, but it does look cool. Day 5 is also the day that I put in some actual unit models for armies to kind of make them look like something interesting. So they walk up to each other and then start hitting each other with a stick. So with 128 armies all animating at the same time, the frame rate drops considerably. It gives some life to the game for sure, but it's not exactly an essential feature. And at the end of this day, I was pretty convinced that I was going to have nothing to show for this video. We only have one day left, and I'm supposed to finish an entire grand strategy game in that one day. I mean, I don't even have a functional economy yet. So I decided to spend the 6th day focusing as hard as I could on building an economy system. I knew I wanted dynamic trade because I was complaining about dynamic trade in EU4 So I started to put together a system where each settlement would determine its nearest settlements and basically create trade partners with them. If I display these partnerships on the map, we end up with this funny looking network, which seems a little bit janky, but is actually more or less correct. If I display it like this, you see that the thickness of the line at the destination is proportional to the trade value of that area relative to the other one. And this kind of tells you how some areas are working as hubs while other ones are more like pass-through trading posts, which is really cool. But again, there are no trade goods or anything like that. This is all being calculated based on prosperity and population level. And each country gets a portion of this trade as like taxes, right? With a little bit of tweaking, we have something that looks semi-coherent. And I also reworked the UI a little bit to make it look nicer. So now settlements, the UI for settlements pops up in front of them when you're zoomed in. And when you're zoomed out, you can see the country level text. This is something more similar to Mountain Blade, but I was hoping they might solve my problem of not having map modes and not having, shader-based actual map displays with like the colors of each country on the map. I'm sure there's a solution to this problem that I just can't figure out. And I could ask AI, but for various reasons, I decided not to use AI for this project at all. And we'll get into that in a bit. So yeah, 8 hours later, this is the best I could do. This is what we have to work with. So, a week has ended, and this is the project that I came up with. The first question we should probably ask ourselves is, did I make a game? I mean, it runs pretty well. In fact, it runs so well that you can run it in a browser. I definitely created a piece of software that functions. But is it a game? Well, a game is supposed to be fun and it's supposed to have some sort of looping purpose. And I don't know if we have any of that here. So no, I don't think I made a game. I think what I made is at best a tech demo. Despite it just being a basically glorified tech demo, I think it's pretty cool how much was able to get done in just 1 week with one person. And again, I don't even know how to program that well. I'm self-taught. So with day 6 over, that concluded this challenge. But before we decide if this was a success or a failure, I have a confession to make. I was lying at the beginning of this video. I wasn't lying about how it only took 6 days. I really did only spend 6 days on this. But I failed to mention that those 6 days were actually in 2023. That's right, it's been almost 3 years since I worked on this project. So solutions like using AI to write the shader language for me were pretty much not an option back then. So let's answer the premise of this video. Can you make a grand strategy game in just 1 week? I think someone else could. I don't think that person is me. I was encountering a lot of scope creep, even just in the limited time that I had. And that's like a typical problem for these types of games, so it's no surprise. But even though I knew that that was going to be an issue, I still couldn't avoid it. If we look at my original Trello board for this project, I had so many things planned. I wasn't even done fixing up the trade networks. I was going to set up a population system, policies tab, better UI for the battles. I have to make the AI for army movement. I didn't even make that. Reworking settlements so that they're actually like a functional design, and then setting up the economy where all the things would fit together and you'd actually have incentives to go to war or like defend certain areas. A bunch of UI stuff, improved battles even more. Some sort of like skill tree or tech tree or idea tree was really interesting to me. Obviously that didn't get implemented. And then navies, they're just in there. They don't do anything. Something that I think is interesting though is that I was working on this years and years before EU5 was even announced. And a lot of what I wanted was actually delivered by EU5. I wanted a population system that actually counted each individual person. I wanted dynamic trade networks. I wanted a supply system for armies. All of that got delivered. And look at this. One of my updates ideas was having centralization be like a stat that you have to pay for. Isn't that interesting? I think it just goes to show that a lot of EU5's design really was a natural continuation of EU4. As much as the reviews and all the conversation seems to be divided and confused about that. Now, I'm not defending the game per se, but I think a lot of the design is what was promised by something like EU4 2. You know what I mean? Another big thing that I failed to do was learn how to work multiplayer into this whole thing. I spent some time making a Kirby racing game to try to learn how to do multiplayer, and I got it working, but it was awful. So I don't know if I would have been able to do multiplayer at all. And a game like this without multiplayer probably wouldn't be viable. So yeah, let me know what you think of this whole thing. Did I make something worth making? Should I continue making it? I really don't know. I really can't gauge. It's hard because there are so many things that I want to work on at all times, and I just can't do all of them. I just can't. So maybe some feedback would be helpful on this, you know? Whether it's me or someone else though, I do think that there's some space for like an indie market within the grand strategy genre. I know that seems inconceivable, but I think this tech demo in 6 days shows that you can make something. It's not going to be at the scope and level of content and level of detail of EU5, but you can make something. And maybe that something is enough to make people interested. Just some thoughts. I don't know. I'm very interested what other people think about this whole issue, especially since the market is pretty frustrated in terms of like review scores and DLC monetization. Is there potential for like an indie scene in this? I think so.